Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. We begin a new series this week entitled Animals in Literature, exploring the ways in which anthropomorphic animals through the ages have inspired and revealed more about our humanity to ourselves. Why is it that talking creatures living in wonderful little cottages built underground with teacups and saucers and waistcoats and top hats, how is it that they come to be part of the mirror that we hold up to learn more about ourselves? I really appreciate what Madeleine L'Engle had to say about animals. The frog is unworried by the self-consciousness with which the human animal is stuck. It is our blessing and our curse. Not only do we know that we know, and we are not often willing to face how little we know. That's what The Plunge is all about. Facing the things that we sense and feel and perhaps intuit, but don't completely understand. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited for this series. If you came for the Tolkien, stay for the Lewis Carroll and the Kenneth Grahame and the E.B. White and more that are to come in this series, Animals in Literature. I'm here with returning guest, quickly becoming a favorite, Landon Loftin. Landon, it's so good to see you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. You wrote an essay about a story called The Wind in the Willows, and for this series, we're talking about animals in literature. My recollection, just so we're setting the stage, is of an animated film that Disney produced in, I think, like the late 1940s. But as a child, I remember seeing Mr. Toad driving a car like a madman and all sorts of things. But I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about The Wind in the Willows and what makes it so great.
Yeah, well, I am not personally a fan of the film, but we can agree to disagree on that if we'd like.
I
The
was
uh,
very
the
young, so
yeah, well, the book itself is such a beautiful book. It's one of the most beautifully written books in the English language, in my opinion. I love The Wind in the Willows, and I think as a work of literature, it's a very sophisticated work of literature, and it's not often recognized as such. And there are reasons for that. One, because I think people have false associations, either with some of the bad marketing or adaptation that's been done of The Wind in the Willows, or also just preconceived ideas about animal tales and children's literature and that sort of thing, which cause them to misunderstand and misevaluate the the book itself. So I love the book. And I didn't read it as a child. I read it for the first time as an adult, but it is definitely one of my favorites.
thank you. Well, I think I've shared this before, both in recordings but in aside conversations. One of the key drivers for me in creating this channel is to educate myself. So I look forward to discovering from you during this conversation what leads you to give this story such high praise. And so I also have a recollection as a child, speaking of animals in literature, of Aesop's fables. And in particular, I have this image in my head. I probably was in kindergarten. I don't remember, but it was a crow that was filling a pitcher with rocks.
Mhm.
And it's just still, we're talking now 45 plus years later, I still can picture that from
Yeah.
Aesop's fables and a host of other things. But I'm curious as to if you have any thoughts on The Wind in the Willows and Kenneth Grahame's work with anthropomorphic animals, extending that tradition and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So The Wind in the Willows, I'm just going to call it The Willows for short. It's
Okay.
usually classified as a specimen of the beast fable or animal tale tradition, though there are critics who object to that, but that's neither here nor there. The tradition is usually thought to be fathered by Aesop. Aesop, the ancient Greek writer, the one that we attribute those short didactic fables to, the ones that we all read in childhood. There's some disagreement about, what we can actually attribute to him, and certainly the forms in which most of us read them are not the forms that that they were in when Aesop wrote them. But nevertheless, we have this big set of short stories associated with Aesop, and writers have followed in the footsteps of Aesop in the animal trail tradition for quite some time, because he wrote a very long time ago. When I say that his fables are didactic, I don't know what his intentions were, but the editions of Aesop's fables that you find now typically have a story and then a moral, and that's what I mean. It's a story that's intended or understood as being intended to teach a particular moral lesson, and that's one of the distinguishing features of Aesop's fables. Many writers in the animal tale tradition have followed after him in that, but obviously, short didactic fables are not the best medium for psychologically sophisticated characterizations. But nevertheless, the tradition has adapted. It's adapted to more modern literary sensibilities, which, for better or for worse, tend to favor psychological complexity over moral clarity. To see the connection here to children's literature, though, I think we need to turn to Lewis.
Absolutely. Boy, that's an interesting expression you just used, though, the psychological complexity over moral clarity. Um, I'll jump to Lewis, I promise, but I'm just curious if you have any inkling as to the time frame in which that began to be a part or a component of these stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, it would be hard to do because it was such a slow, gradual process.
Yeah.
But if you consider, if you read ancient or medieval literature, you don't see the kind of interest in like conflicted human psychologies that you see in, like, say, the modern novel. And the point that I want to make is that the animal tale tradition, Graham being a part of it, and I'll talk more about this later, has evolved a lot since Aesop's day, and yet there's this continuity. And there are reasons why people have been interested in using anthropomorphic animals beyond, that they're cute or that kids like them or something like that. That there's actually serious artistic and literary reasons why authors have chosen anthropomorphic animals and have written within this tradition that stems from Aesop.
Makes sense. So we were just about to talk about C.S. Lewis, and I have it that he praises the animal characters, and I'm curious about how animal tales help readers, especially children, grasp that complexity of the human trait without actual humans.
Yeah. Okay. It's a great question and it needs a long answer, so bear with me for a minute. Lewis made a number of really insightful observations about the Willows. That's actually why I read it, is because Lewis loved it so much, and many of the things I've read, because authors I like say that people should read it, so I do. And I'll just comment on a couple relevant passages now. The first is from an essay called Three Ways of Writing for Children. And he uses the Willows to show how a story can use, these are his words, beings other than human, which yet behave in varying degrees humanly. Um, how those can be used as accessible stand-ins for more complex realities. So according to Lewis, these kinds of non-human characters that are nevertheless human-like can serve, quote, as an admirable hieroglyphic which conveys psychology, types of character, more briefly than novelistic presentation, and to readers whom novelistic presentation could not yet reach. So, for example, he says, consider Mr. Badger, my favorite character in The Wind in the Willows. He says, consider Mr. Badger, that extraordinary amalgam of high rank, coarse manners, gruffness, shyness, and goodness. The child who has once met Mr. Badger has ever afterwards in its bones a knowledge of humanity and English social history which it could not get in any other way. So it sort of casts at an intuitive level this complex reality, but it's an intuition that is accessible to children. They can sort of see it for what it is without understanding maybe all the particulars of English social history that would inform an adult's reading of Graham's portrayal of Mr. Badger. And that wouldn't be possible if he wasn't using animals. So there's another passage from an essay called On Stories that makes this point. Lewis asks us to consider whether Graham made an arbitrary choice when he gave his principal character the form of a toad, or that of a stag, a pigeon, or a lion. Would any of those have done as well? That's what Lewis asks. And his answer is an emphatic no. He says, these are his words, the choice is based on the fact that the real toad's face has a grotesque resemblance to a certain kind of human face, a rather apoplectic face with a fatuous grin. So, Graham's readers find isolated and fixed an aspect of human vanity in its funniest and most pardonable form. We have, henceforward, more amusement and kindness toward a certain kind of vanity in real life. Again, it's a similar point, but the fact that the characters are anthropomorphic animals is essential to this kind of literary effect, or this mode of communicating certain truths. And as I thought about these quotes, it seems to me they give us the beginnings of an answer to the question that many interpreters of the Willows and of all the animal tales and beast fables ask is, if the goal is to communicate something about humanity, why use animals or animalian guises at all? You'd think it'd be easier just to make them human beings. But that, I think, misses the point. The point that Lewis seems to think is that a writer is, in many cases, better able to convey humanity in his or her characters by making them less obviously human. It's a paradox, but it's borne out by the experience of many readers who have returned to these stories over and over again. So it's sort of a commonplace for critics. They'll praise writers whose characters are at once uniquely individual and yet at the same time evoke things that are common, that are typical, or that are universal in some sense. And that is to say, characters that are themselves, very much themselves, and yet represent something bigger or more than themselves. And one of those critics is Samuel Johnson. And there's an important point here related to an observation he made about Shakespeare. He famously praised Shakespeare's characters as being the genuine progeny of common humanity. And then he says, in the work of lesser writers, a character is too often an individual, but in those of Shakespeare, it's commonly a species. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, I understand Lewis's point now, because that's not what Johnson was talking about. He wasn't talking about animal tales or anything like that. Shakespeare was not a writer in that tradition. But it helps us see that the artifice of literal distinctions in species can achieve this same kind of effect that Shakespeare achieved without it. But it can be helpful in this end of portrayal of recognizable types. And moreover, it has the advantage of portraying those types in a way that's accessible to younger readers, to children. And that's probably why animals have loomed so large in the history of children's literature. That's probably part of the reason why.
That makes a great deal of sense. I really appreciate that quote from Samuel Johnson in particular. I also like how Lewis and yourself have distinguished that the toad was essential to represent, and there's something about the imagery that is evoked in our minds of a particular. I think I don't know that it's correlated, but I often think of the comment that people made regarding dogs and their owners resembling one another over time. And I know that you're a passionate defender and lover of animals. And so I'm curious if that has any connection to what we're talking about here with regard to the species.
I think so. I mean, I think when we see that this sort of uncanny resemblance between pets and their owners, it's because we've built up this vast web of associations in our mind between certain characteristics of non-human creatures and the humans that are drawn to them. And so we have this sort of reservoir of associations in our subconscious minds. And that accounts, I think, both for us recognizing some kind of resemblance between pets and their owners, and also recognizing in Kenneth Grahame's portrayal of a toad something that we understand to be a type of human psychology, where he's tapping into that subconscious well of associations.
Delightful. I so appreciate how you bring in additional voices to support the concepts that you're sharing. That's really beneficial. So I just take a moment to appreciate that and share my gratitude. You mentioned Aesop, and of course, that's going back several thousand years now, but the time period of influences from Aesop to the Romantic age and the Romantics in writing. Um, how would you talk about the way that the animal tale genre has evolved to sort of address that moral instruction? Because we've talked about the psychological depth versus the moral clarity. What do we take from that?
Yeah, so again, if we're thinking of The Wind in the Willows as a representative of the beast fable or animal tale tradition, um, we do that because Graham's book is usually read as a children's story about animals with human traits. There are scholars and literary critics who deny both these contentions, that it's a children's story and that it's about animals. But again, that's a conversation we don't have to have here. But the point here is that I want to make is the animal tale tradition is not a static tradition. It's developed over time, and that development can be usefully illustrated in the differences between Aesop and Graham. So unlike most of Aesop's fables, or at least the fables that we attribute to Aesop, The Willows is neither short, simple, nor didactic, or at least it's not didactic in any kind of straightforward or heavy-handed way. And we know that this was intentional on Graham's part, because he actually wrote an introduction to an Edwardian edition of Aesop's Fables. And in that introduction, he expressed a sort of low-level contempt for the motives behind the use of stories, especially stories about animals, for as a means of moral instruction. So he wrote, these are his words, using the word fable as a synonym for morality tale. He said, "The story henceforth will be tolerated only for itself. The fable has had its day and ceased to be." So Graham didn't really care for the didactic quality of many animal tales. But this didn't put his work outside of the bounds of the tradition. What it shows, I think, is that Graham was pushing that tradition further along a trajectory of change that it had been on for a really long time, as we uh, talked about earlier. And this is a trajectory that aligns with larger movements in the history of Western literature. So you can find an example of this in medieval authors who adapted Aesop's fables as Christian allegories. They did that in a way that reflected both the religious outlook and the literary fashions of medieval Europe. But you also see later authors following the rise of the modern novel who began writing animal tales that were longer and subtler, more formally sophisticated. And it's on that trajectory that you find predecessors to The Willows, like Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, which comes, a little bit before The Wind in the Willows. And then afterward, you find books like Animal Farm and Watership Down.
Hmm.
These are not, Animal Farm's not really a children's book, and they're not simple or short or didactic. So in many ways, the tradition has changed immensely, and yet there's still this continuity that is easy to discern if you sort of read systematically through the major animal tales and beast fables in Western literature.
Hmm. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing Graham's opinion as well. I'm always curious when a, very gifted writer, storyteller is willing to share their technical opinion about things, right? Because so much of it seems to be a gift beyond comprehension, as you describe, his prose and his storytelling and character development, such a challenging thing to master. So it's really cool to learn of his own objective stance on this tradition. I would love to chat about Mr. Tolkien and this debate apparently that, and of course, this is drawing from your article, which I didn't mention this before, but I don't know if it's available, if it's something I can share in the show notes
Yeah,
at the,
it's available. It's open access. So you can put a link.
wonderful. Wonderful. I'll be sure to insert the link for those who would like to take a deeper dive into what you've produced. Um, but Tolkien's debating the inclusion of Pan in The Wind and the Willows as potentially disruptive. And I'm curious about this sort of blend of animal worlds and classical gods or mythical things, elements. Um, does that benefit or does it disrupt?
Yeah, well, I love Tolkien, and you and I just had a chat about Tolkien not long ago, which was great. But I don't agree with his assessment here. Now, to be clear, this chapter, it's called Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and the Greek demigod Pan sort of appears out of nowhere in the woods, and it is shocking and confusing to a lot of people. That chapter consistently polarizes readers. If you take 10 people who have read The Wind and the Willows, this will be the thing that they argue about. Was this chapter a flaw? Was it a mistake? Or is it the unspeakably beautiful climax of the book? I'm in that camp. I think it's the perfect climax to the book, but not everybody sees it that way. And Tolkien, to be clear, he was a great admirer of Graham, so he wasn't generally critical of Graham. He loved The Wind and the Willows. He described it in different places as excellent, as delightful, and in contrast to critics who objected to the whole book as being too materially and stylistically eclectic, Tolkien said that no, it was an almost perfect blend of many pigments. Those are his words. And yet he did see the appearance of Pan as a blemish on the otherwise masterful painting. So he willingly admitted that the chapter, Piper in the Gates of Dawn, is a beautiful color in itself, but he says that in Pan we have that addition of a little color that spoils the palette. Now,
Hmm.
I understand Tolkien's criticism. I know many people who share his view on that particular chapter, but I can't easily sympathize with it. And there's probably, I think there's a number of reasons why people read it differently. One of them is that some people have a knowledge of classical literature and they bring that to The Wind and the Willows, and they don't see how Pan has been assimilated and integrated into English literature and into the imagination of English speaking people through, starting way back in the Elizabethan age and then moving on, especially in the Romantics, and then the Edwardians, which Graham was an Edwardian. They were particularly enamored with Pan. So that's when, Peter Pan was the most famous play in England and that sort of thing. All over Edwardian literature, you've got Pan. He shows up everywhere. And if you read it in that light, if you see Pan coming into the story about, that has a very Edwardian English character about these animals on a riverbank in rural England, it doesn't seem too strange to me. Uh, but if you have classical depictions of Pan in mind, then it seems like a really odd choice to bring him in to this story. And there are other reasons why people object to it, but I think that's the big one. And I don't know. To me, it's just the beautiful, natural, inevitable climax, and it's what gives coherence to the rest of the story. Whereas so many people see it as being the thing that doesn't fit in with the rest of the story.
I see. Well, for those who may have forgotten, Pan is like a representation of shepherding, I believe. Plays music, is a half man, half goat figure, and human upper torso. I guess the word is a satyr. Satyr is
Yes,
another
yeah,
similar type.
yeah.
I just wanted to pause for a second and just ask, for you, if that symbolism is the part that makes it so perfect, or is there some other feature to that chapter that resonates for you?
Yeah. Well, let me just say some things about Pan, and then I'll talk about how Pan was assimilated into English literature, and hopefully an answer to that question will emerge. So, yeah, you're right. Pan is first and foremost a demigod drawn from Greek myth, but anybody who knows much about Greek myth will notice that Graham's depiction of Pan is very different than that which is found in classical writings, and they tend to portray Pan as being wild, as being lecherous, as being aggressive, as being lustful and instinctual. And his very presence inspired the onset of fear, a special kind of fear that leads unsuspecting travelers in his rural domain to panic. That's where we get that word. It's drawn from the effect that Pan had on people who encountered him. Panic. So in the Willows, Pan is portrayed very differently. He's portrayed as kind and gentle. He's a friend and a helper of hapless woodland creatures. And even though he inspires a kind of awe, and awe has an element of fear, it's not the kind of awe, fear that brings about panic. It's a kind of awe that brings to the creatures who encounter him a supernatural calm. So the question is, why is Pan here at all? If Graham was going to do such violence to the classical sources by twisting Pan to his own liking, and part of that answer is, again, he's not drawing from classical sources, or at least not primarily and directly. He's drawing from the long tradition of British writers who have adopted Pan, who have adapted Pan for their own purposes, and that's a tradition that reached something of a pinnacle in the Edwardian age, as I said. And so whatever he meant to the ancient Greeks, by the time of the Romantics, Pan had become a symbol representing an archetype of paternal benevolence who made his home in rural England. And so I think if you're familiar with the literature in which Pan is being slowly assimilated into the modern imagination, it seems like a pretty natural fit. Um, so So yeah, I think if you read Wordsworth is Graham's hands down favorite author, most influential author. If you read the poems of Wordsworth, you get depictions of Pan that are exactly like Graham's. And so he's not really innovating at all. To him, it was quite natural.
Interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you for illuminating us on that point. I'd love to turn to Mr. Toad if you're ready for that, and curious about how the character of Toad in The Wind in the Willows parodies heroes from Homer, maybe like Ulysses, and perhaps a little bit more conversation around satire in anthropomorphic animal stories.
Yeah, good. So I'll talk about Toad and Homer first, and then we'll say something about satire. Um, Graham was an enthusiastic reader of Homer. He loved Homer. I believe he read it in translation, not in Greek, so he would have, read like Chapman's Homer or something like that. And he, uh, unsurprisingly, his work it's shot through with Homeric allusions. The most obvious in The Willows would be the name of the final chapter, the return of Ulysses. Ulysses being another name for Odysseus. I prefer Odysseus, so that's what I'm going to say. So here Graham's highlighting similarities between the story he tells about Toad and the story of Odysseus, as it's told in Homer's Odyssey. Here's a list of similarities that I came up with when I was writing the article. Both characters, Toad and Odysseus, they both journey into foreign lands, which are full of attractions and temptations and dangers. Both are delayed and detained on their journey home. Both are taken captive and forced to devise clever escapes. Both eventually make it home, but find their homecoming marred by the presence of opportunists who have attempted to commandeer their ancestral estates. And both, with the help of a loyal remnant, have to fight to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And in addition to that, it's not just the plot, it's also the characters. They're reminiscent of each other, most obviously in the fact that they're both tricksters. They're masters of deception. They use cunning to get what they want from their friends and their enemies alike. But in addition to all the similarities, there's also differences. So, and the differences are where the satire comes in, because Graham is satirizing a certain kind of person, a certain sort of personality that lacks self-awareness, that has some narcissistic tendencies. And so by suggesting this comparison between the heroic Odysseus and the silly, frivolous Toad, Graham's being satirical, and this is obvious to every reader, but it's not obvious to Toad. Right? He imagines himself to be, or to be perceived as, a figure whose exploits are destined to be immortalized in legend and song. But to everybody else, he just looks ridiculous, and he makes life hard for everybody around him. And so that's, I think, where the satire comes in. It's interesting. There's an annotated version of The Wind in the Willows, annotated by Seth Lehrer. It's a really good edition to buy if you're going to read the book. And he talks a lot about the psychology texts that were current in Edwardian society and their understanding of psychology and psychiatry and the like, and makes a lot of interesting connections to Toad as exemplifying the Edwardian understanding of certain kinds of psychiatric disorders. And so that was really interesting for me to read about, and Graham is sort of satirizing some of that.
That's really fascinating. What was the name of that person who annotated
Seth
the
Lehrer.
edition? Seth Lehrer. Fascinating. Yeah. So the Edwardian period, that's just at the dawn of the 1900s. Is that correct, roughly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we have this burgeoning curiosity. I think I spoke with Serena Higgins in an earlier, actually the very first episode of the Tolkien series. And she and I got into a conversation about the sort of curiosity about the mind and about where thoughts come from and how people's personalities develop and all of this that was happening both in the US and in Europe and England during that sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. So that's fascinating. Always to take into account the context in which people are writing their stories, right? I'd love to turn to your thoughts on why someone like Graham would choose animals over humans, to explore in particular these themes of homecoming and restlessness, which you've addressed a little bit with the comparison to Odysseus with Mr. Toad, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the book begins with the sudden onset of restlessness in arguably the main character, the mole, and he leaves his safe and comfortable underground home in search of the open, sunlit world above. More than one critic has pointed out that this is sort of like his underground home is something like a womb, and he's then leaving, going out into the world to grow up. And once he's seen the riverbank, he is so taken with it that he completely forgets his old home, at least for a time, until he unexpectedly catches the scent on a journey through the woods with his new best friend, the water rat. And he follows the scent home, but contrary to the fervent expectation that he had, his homecoming elicits some mixed feelings. In fact, he quickly discovers that even though everything remains pretty much the same, he himself has changed, and his new experiences have changed him in a way that, despite the comfort that he does feel when surrounded by old and familiar things, Graham says, these are Graham's words, he realizes that he can no longer be content there, and he chooses to leave. Graham puts it this way, he did not at all want to abandon the new life and its splendid spaces, to turn his back on sun and air and all they offered him, and creep home and stay there. The upper world was all too strong. It called to him still, even down there, and he knew he must return to the larger stage. So this is all bittersweet, but ultimately more sweet than bitter, because despite that Mole can no longer be at home in his old house, his return is it's like a reclamation of what he left behind, and it was a necessary step toward his integration of the past and the present. And this pattern is repeated in the development of Graham's other characters. So this happens throughout the book. So The Wind in the Willows has a fairly loose plot, but there's patterns throughout it that give it unity. And we see it most obviously in Mole's Friend Rat, but we might have occasion to return to that later.
There's something about burrowing animals that just they just fascinate me, you know. Just yeah, I guess any creature that lives either subterranean or underwater life, you know, is so they inhabit a completely different world in so many ways. Anyway,
Yeah.
makes me chuckle picturing a mole and a rat on adventures.
Yeah.
Um, I would love to inquire as to another point in your article with respect to romantic poets, and you mentioned Wordsworth earlier. Um, but that influence of Wordsworth and perhaps others in that tradition on Graham's portrayal of nature and childhood innocence. And in particular, this idea, and I have referenced this particular thought probably half a dozen times on this channel, but it lingers with me still, is a reference that Lewis made with respect to animals having more in common with small children than the grown-ups do, and why they're so such a feature of stories that tend to be read to children, is that they share some commonalities with not really understanding how the adult world works and being reliant on the grown-ups for food and provision and protection. But and so it's sort of this nostalgic idea of a pre-modern existence, if you will. And I know I rambled there, so if you need me to repeat the question, I will, but
No, I think I can
have
touch on
at
all
it.
those points because I appreciate all those, and I have that Lewis passage here, so I'll get to it. Okay, so Graham, as I've said, is deeply influenced by the Romantic poets, especially Wordsworth, who's his favorite writer. And Wordsworth and other Romantics were preoccupied with certain kinds of things like the beauty of nature, the innocence of childhood, the constraints imposed by the conditions of the modern world, constraints which force people to suppress their instincts, to sever the connections that originally united us to each other and to the natural world. So, like the Romantics, Graham saw the imagination as, if not an antidote, at least the best form of resistance to this the forces that so easily pull us from the blissful state of innocence and connectedness that many of us might associate with childhood. So that primordial state of bliss, we find that in so many mythologies and religious teachings, and I think for good reason. But for Graham, he was not a deeply religious man by any means. So for him, it was a projection onto the history of the world, of a longing for the golden age of innocence and bliss and childhood. And though he didn't, uh, believe in a real primordial, golden age in human history, nevertheless, his intuitions on this were really strong, and he wrote really powerfully about it. So the Romantics, they're not going to help us get much further in understanding the connection to animal stories, like you asked, but the passage that you referenced from Lewis does. Uh, let's see. The nostalgic longings that the Romantics were concerned with and the literary device of anthropomorphic animals is something that uh, Lewis saw a connection. He observed that the anthropomorphic use of animals helped resolve a tension that's endemic in human experience. That's a tension that arises from the apparent incompatibility between innocence and experience, between sort of like naive enchantment and a disillusioned maturity. To integrate maturity, to have like an enchanted maturity or an experienced innocence or something like that. That's something that the Romantics, they wanted to know how to achieve, and so did Lewis. So for Lewis, he says the Graham's anthropomorphic animals, and he's speaking specifically about Graham's. They are, quote, like children insofar as they have no responsibilities, no struggle for existence, no domestic cares. Meals turn up, and one does not ask who cooked them. And then he goes on to note that the homes of each animal are well stocked, but simple things like dishes raise all kinds of questions. Who kept them clean? Where were they bought? How were they delivered in the wild wood? Then he says Mole is very snug in his subterranean home, but what was he living on? If he's a rentier, where's the bank? What are his investments? The tables in his forecourt are marked with the rings that hinted at beer mugs, but where did he get the beer? So he concludes that the life of all the characters in the Willows is that of children for whom everything is provided and who take everything for granted, but in other ways, it's the life of adults. They go where they like, they do what they please, they arrange their own lives. So for Graham, and I think Lewis understood this well, Graham, in line with the Romantics, saw the imagination wasn't for him an antidote to this kind of tension between childhood and adulthood and innocence and experience and the like. For him, it was more like a consolation. So he was able to write this story where, especially by use of anthropomorphic animals, he was able to sort of cleverly disguise the tension so that we could imaginatively inhabit a world where that tension goes away, where we have, the innocence and the freedom of childhood, and then also the kinds of the freedoms and abilities that come with adulthood. And so it was part of what he was doing is try to imaginatively resolve that tension as a consolation for the fact that he didn't know how to do it in his actual life. Um, so,
Oh, wouldn't that be something? Um, someday, perhaps. Uh, how, continuing on the reconciling of the freedoms of adulthood with the innocence of childhood, is there anything escapist about this and in the broader literary tradition of animal tales?
yeah. So a lot of people will dismiss The Wind in the Willows as being nostalgic and escapist and sentimental and the like. And Lewis himself, he said that there's something to these charges because it does depict, again, his words, a happiness under incompatible conditions, a sort of freedom we can only have in childhood and the sort we can only have in maturity. Uh, but this contradiction, again, Graham cleverly conceals it through the use of animals rather than human beings. If they were humans, the questions would easily amount to objections on the grounds of absurdity. But from a literary standpoint, Graham's animals free him to rely on our greater tolerance of this mystery. And I mean, to return to Tolkien, I think his answer to the critics who called fairy stories escapist in his essay on fairy stories applies just as much here. Why would a prisoner not try to get out? What's wrong with escaping if you're in a prison? And if you have a means for escaping, you should. And I think Graham could say that here is that there's great value in literature and art and other means by which we can exercise our imagination to find consolation for some of the sort of intrinsic barriers to happiness, the kinds of things that the sort of tensions that this side of eternity aren't going to go away. They're just part of human life. And but Graham does more than that. It's not just escapist in the sense that he gives us some relief from the hard realities of life. I think he really points a way toward the best hope of an integration that we can find. So you see this in several of the characters. You see this in what we just spoke about in reference to Mole. Mole coming to his new home. It wasn't just that he got home and was disappointed that it didn't that he could no longer be at home in his old home. It's that he went through this process of reintegrating the past with the present and became a happier and better, more settled creature as a result. And so I think Graham is doing more than just giving us consolation, escape from these tensions that are endemic in human life. He's also pointing us toward a way of integrating as best we can the contradictory, sometimes contradictory desires we have for things that are incompatible.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, and I think there are certainly examples in real life of people who are able to pursue adventure, as it were, and still maintain a stable, cozy home scenario. But not easy always, for sure. Um, the, there was a question, I'm not sure if you've already covered it or if you want to speak any more to it, connecting the Wayfarer's All chapter of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and that, again, using animals to explore the themes of wanderlust and the pull of home.
Yeah, I will say something about that if you don't mind, because it follows pretty naturally from what you just said. There's this tension that is highlighted in The Wind in the Willows between the desire to have a home and to be at home, but also to explore and be free. So to have roots and not to have roots, or to have roots and to have wings. It's not always easy to figure out how to have both without spoiling both in a way. The chapter Wayfarer's All, I love that chapter. And anyone who's read it and who's also read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner will immediately see that Coleridge's story informs the narrative of Wayfarer's All. So we have the water rat, and he's determined to mind his own business when he's confronted with a mysterious stranger, a wayfaring sea rat. And this sea rat holds him sort of spellbound with stories about adventures in southern Europe and that sort of thing. Just as in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, there's the unnamed wedding guest. He's stopped by an old sailor who keeps him from entering the wedding by telling him this captivating story of his voyage through the southern seas. So you can see it's all, it's a deliberate allusion here. And Graham even uses the same kinds of phrases where he memorably describes, uh, um, where he alludes to Coleridge, who deliberately describes the Ancient Mariner as having like a long, skinny hand, lean and keen-featured, and a glittering eye. You find all those phrases repeated in Graham. But there's also some important differences, and those are worth noting. You can see that Wayfarer's All is not simply a retelling of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The Ancient Mariner's journey is a sort of harrowing and phantasmagoric journey through the southern Arctic, and the sea rat goes on this sort of relaxed, sort of vagrant pleasure cruise through southern Europe in the mild climes of Italy and the like. And moreover, the Ancient Mariner for Coleridge is trying to teach an important lesson to the wedding guests. The sea rat is just inviting the water rat to leave his home and to go wander freely and to cut his roots and be free to do what he wants and have adventures. And for a moment, surprisingly, because Rat is so much in love with his home on the riverbank, the Wanderlust begins to well up inside of him, and he feels this unprecedented and terrible discontent with his home. Everything seems bland and boring and overly familiar, and he's now his focus is not on what's in front of him, but whatever's over the horizon, and that's always changing the farther you go toward it. So, he's got this discontent. But the water rat and the wedding guest are affected by these unexpected encounters that they both have with maritime travelers, and they both have the same experience. The famous lines that Coleridge writes, like one that hath been stunned and is of sense forlorn, a sadder and wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. And that was the wedding guest's experience. And in the same way, the water rat, he leaves the encounter with the sea rat feeling listless and disillusioned and dejected. But again, we see the imagination providing consolation. Mole finds him in this state and doesn't know what to do, so he slowly encourages him to think of the things that he knows and loves, says casually then and with seeming indifference. The mole turned the talk to the harvest that was being gathered in, the towering wagons and their straining teams, the growing ricks and the large moon rising over the bare acres dotted with sheaves. It goes on like this, and then he eventually encourages rat to write some poems. And in writing poetry, he recovers his sense of his self and his love of his home. And but it's different. It's a new, more mature and sober love of his home, not the sort of a naive enthusiasm he had before. He sees it for what it is, with its limitations and its imperfections. So he's a sadder and wiser rat rising the next morn. And again, that's a part of, I think, Graham pointing the way forward to a more mature and settled kind of enchantment with the world, instead of the disillusioned maturity that he was afraid was the only option when leaving childhood behind.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Thank you for reading those passages as well. Um, just a couple more questions. Believe it or not, we're nearing the end. I do so enjoy these conversations. Your article highlights the river, and we just talked about the rat by the river bed and the sea rat taking his cruises through Europe. But as a symbol of imagination, how does the river connect to classical and romantic sources, and what perhaps other natural elements might be connected in this regard?
Yeah, sure. So the idea that the river in The Wind in the Willows serves as a symbol of the imagination is one that I've found in a number of sources. Just reading some criticism of The Wind in the Willows, people saying, well, obviously the river is the central symbol and it's the symbol of the imagination. So that's not an idea that I've had. It's just something that critics of The Wind in the Willows have been saying. And so for my article, I decided to try to run with that and try to show how I think if the river is fed by tributaries, the river of Graham's imagination is fed by tributaries, that the most important ones are the classical and the romantic, but that it's not just simply an intermingling of the classical and romantic tributaries. It's sort of a new synthesis, um, that where he's fully integrated those into his vision of the world. So that's what that's all about. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a whole lot more to say about it. It is a powerful symbol. The natural elements often in these sorts of animal tales serve as like a central symbol. Like, I think of another story in the animal tale tradition I love is the Jungle Book, and the symbol of fire, or as they call it, the red flower. And it's a symbol of both the creative and the destructive capacities of human beings. And it's sort of pervades the whole story as the river pervades Graham's.
Thank you. Yeah. I need to see if I can get somebody on to talk about the Jungle Book for this
Mhm.
series. That'd be a
Yeah.
lot of fun. Well, my last question, and then anything else that you'd like to add in conclusion, is that unity of the Wind and Willows, attributed to that confluence, as you described, the tributaries of classical and romantic influences converging. How does it benefit us to sort of examine these hybrid origins in animal literature to appreciate this particular genre, as it bridges, again, we come back full circle, as it bridges the ancient and the modern storytelling?
Yeah. Well, in my article, I only mean to say that for Graham, it's the confluence of the classical and the romantic that gives the sort of distinctive character to his vision. Of course, other writers in the tradition uh, have have been certainly influenced by the classical, and then the more recent ones by the romantics. But I don't want to generalize about animal literature and those two uh, tributaries of influence. Of course, I mean, the classical, all Western literature is influenced by the classical, and all modern literature, or anything worth reading, has some influence of the romantics. Um, but yeah, I mean, to me, the reason why this, maybe I'll tell you about how this article came to be. I was asked to teach a middle school literature class, which was great fun. but I couldn't decide what to assign. But the one thing I wanted them to get out of the class is a sense that all literature is best read uh, as a participant in a broader tradition, that there's a great conversation that's been happening for thousands of years, and that the more you understand the conversation as the whole, the more you can appreciate each part of it. And so I assigned The Wind and the Willows, but before they read it, I had them read the classical sources and the stories about Greek mythology and Pan and selections from the Odyssey. And I didn't tell them why. They just thought I was assigning them because that's what teachers do. And then we moved on to a period where we studied the Romantics. We studied Wordsworth and we read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And then when we read The Wind and the Willows, they said, "Oh, every page we remember something we read. This reminds us of this, and this is where he's getting this." And they were really excited about it, and I was really excited about it. And that's how the article came to be. Is I thought, well, I put all the thought into hunting down Graham's sources, and they seem to come from two directions. And so that's the rest is history, I guess.
It just brought me a quote from Paul Harvey. I don't know if he's before your time, but had a radio program, and that's the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's dating myself. Thank you, Landon. Any other thoughts that you want to wrap us up with here on The Wind and the Willows or Ken Graham?
No, I don't think so. I'd appreciate it if people are interested, if they would read the article. When you work hard on something, it's nice to know some people are reading it. But that's all, and I really appreciate you having me on again.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure, and we'll post the link to the article, and people check out The Wind and the Willows through the eyes of Landon Loftin, but also read it for yourself. Check out the Seth Lehrer edition, and thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the aforementioned story from Aesop's Fables, The Crow and the Pitcher. If you'll recall, I have a vivid memory of the illustration of this story from my kindergarten days, and I thought, what better as we start animals in literature than to go back to Aesop and his fables for the crow and the pitcher. In a spell of dry weather, when the birds could find very little to drink, a thirsty crow found a pitcher with a little water in it. But the pitcher was high and had a narrow neck, and no matter how he tried, the crow could not reach the water. The poor thing felt as if he must die of thirst. Then an idea came to him. Picking up some small pebbles, he dropped them into the pitcher one by one. With each pebble, the water rose a little higher until at last it was near enough so he could drink. The moral of this story, of course, in a pinch, a good use of our wits may help us out. Thank you to the Crow and the Pitcher, and of course, to Aesop for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.